Hello, everyone. Welcome to another fine episode of The More You Know. And today we're going to practice on some vocal skills because today's going to be all about public speaking and how we can improve you to getting that dream job that you want or that promotion that you want when you make your case in the boardroom of executives, and how you can be confident, strong, and impactful. I'm joined with Marco today. Marco, you've been and we've talked before the recording, and he seems like he knows his stuff, and I can't wait to hear more about it. Marco, can you give us a brief intro of yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited to get a chance to share a little bit of what I know. I lead a little bit of a dual life. I by day am working in customer success. I manage a team that really helps our customers learn how to use our platform strategically. And I've been in customer success for about 8 years and have worked in different types of business models from enterprise to direct to consumer sales. And it's been really gratifying for me. By every other time outside of the 9 to 5 or 9 to 6, I run my own company called Extempora. We are a communications training company that really helps young professionals learn how to speak with confidence and credibility in the workplace, whether that's helping you land a job or if, as you said, walking into a boardroom and trying to convince stakeholders that you have something to offer. Everything else in between, we kind of work with people one on one and through large scale workshops. So it's a really great way for me to flex different muscles than what I do day to day.
Yeah, yeah, I love it. I love it, and I think it's very important that there are services like this out there because in college I did take some business courses where like it did practice on like presentation skills and all that, but just because you know how to present stuff doesn't mean that you really know what to talk about sometimes. And I feel like some of them didn't really prepare me much for interviews for when I was a senior looking for, or even when I was a junior looking for internships, or when I was a senior looking for full time jobs. I feel like I was kind of just thrown in to the world of interviewing and how we should act, how we should sound. And I feel like there's a lot of guidelines that were not taught in school or in the education system of what needs to be like, how you should really, really prepare for it.
100%. I went to school in Ontario in Canada, and in grade 10 we had one course on careers and it was half the term long. And the next best thing that I had in terms of public speaking training, let's call it, was in university. And we did one course on public speaking that was solely focused on giving speeches in front of a large audience. And we're not really taught how to sell ourselves or what are some of the tools that we need to even explore fruitful or a meaningful exploration into what our speaking style is. And that to me is a big shame. In addition to thinking about just day to day, right? Nobody is encouraged to think about why they're amazing. uh, Otherwise, you're kind of painted as this idea of, hey, you're maybe boasting, right? And so by nature, we're already not wired to talk about why we're so awesome and how to sell ourselves. So when we're now thrown into the interview space, for example, and our entire job is to persuade someone that we have the goods to do a job and that we're better than everyone else that they're talking about, we're not prepared to do so. And that's really a big part of why I started Extempora, is to empower people to think about their stories a little bit differently and to celebrate the things that make them amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. I feel like a lot of a lot of applicants really do a lot. Like I feel like a lot of people do a lot with their job that they're currently in, or even the extra, or even in the extracurricular activities that they do. I feel like a lot of people do a lot of interesting things, and they do a lot in their position. They do a lot outside of work in the community, but it's very difficult sometimes trying to kind of put that on paper and kind of sell that to companies or sell that to people because it's kind of harder, I want to say, to kind of put it into words. When you get, like, let's just say, applicants who are trying to improve their interview skills, what are some things that you kind of help, well, tell them to, like, is there like a format that you use for when they want to sell themselves, or like how you can make them sound more interesting?
Absolutely. I think there are different models of doing, right? The first thing that I always encourage people to think about is what are some of the types of questions that I anticipate walking into an interview? And I break it down into five different categories. There are the about you questions. Tell me about yourself. What are your greatest strengths? Those types of things. The second are behavioral and situational questions. Tell me about a time when you did X. If I had this scenario, how would you approach it? The third are technical questions. So, depending on the industry that you're in, it might be about the lingo, it might be about success metrics, the tools that you would use. Number four would be negative reframe questions. You're posed with a situation that might paint you into negative light. What did you learn? How did you grow from that experience? And then finally, are what I call extemporaneous questions. These are the ones that are right out of the left field. And the first thing that I go over with my customers and clients is how, let's do a quick brainstorming based on the roles that you're interested in. What do you think are some of the questions that will come up in each one of these types of question types? The second thing that we then work on are your stories. So, what I encourage people to do is to audit their resume. And for each of their experiences, each of their bullet points, I want you to come up with a really detailed and thorough story. What I mean by that is what did you do? What were you responsible for? What tools did you use? What's the context and scale in which you did that? Right. So, as a trainer in public speaking, for example, I can say I train people. And that's great. I get a general sense of the task that I do. But if I start including numbers like I train people one on one, and I also train people in large scale workshops for anywhere ranging from 5 to 300 people, now the interviewer knows what my area of specialty can be and what my capabilities are. So, what's the context and scale? And then, most importantly, what was the impact? I speak with so many people that only talk about the task itself, and they don't actually tell me where did you move the needle, and or what did you learn, or how did you progress, right? These are all important things that really help to solidify your skills and what you're going to bring to the table. So between understanding the structure of the question and then telling really compelling stories that are full of rich details, that's the basic formula. And then it's about putting it all together and thinking about how do you convert these long stories and maybe recycle them in smaller segments for different types of questions. So that's the progression that I usually walk through with someone that's maybe a little bit newer to interviewing.
Gotcha. It sounds a lot like the STAR method. Are you familiar with the STAR method of interviews and all that?
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like you really do prepare them for, like, setting up and structuring their responses for the STAR method, because I feel like a lot of people, well, I I can speak from experience. For me, sometimes I lose sight of the STAR method, so sometimes I kind of just say like the position, well, like the action, but I never really continue. Well, I sometimes did I continue on to like how it changed me.
Absolutely. I definitely leverage the bar method for specific types of questions. About you questions are a great one. Behavioral situational questions, another really great example of where you can really demonstrate not only what you did, but that impact piece. But there are other scenarios in which that might not be your best path to telling a compelling story, right? In something that maybe is an extemporaneous question, left field question, right? An example of that might be tell me about the number of manhole covers that are in your city, or how would you approach uh, figuring out the number of tattoos that that exists within the population. These things you don't actually have a result, and it's all about the approach and the methodology. At which point you might flip your structure of your answer to something that's a little bit more chronologically based, or based on phases, right? So you might say, this is the first phase of analysis that I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to, second phase of analysis that I'm going to do. These are the assumptions I'm going to make. And then as a result, here's how I come up with my conclusion. So you'll see here that it's a slightly different model, but everything is still structured in such a way that it's really easy to follow. Instead of saying, here are the 10 steps I'm doing, I break it down into phases so that it's more digestible for the hiring manager or the interviewer to write down their notes and go, you know what, this person's really methodical in a very thoughtful way. So the bar method is super duper important, but there are other structures out there that might be more beneficial depending on what the question is, and that's really the art of interviewing, is figuring out what's the best structure and what's the best story that I can tell given a particular type of question.
Gotcha. Have you talked to recruiters and interviewers at companies and kind of pick their brains about what they do during interviews, and then that's how kind of you structure your courses or how you structure your advice toward applicants?
Absolutely. I'm also a hiring manager myself, so
Oh,
that
okay.
helps a lot, as I know, generally speaking, what are the metrics to success, right? So first and foremost, I would say it really depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to HR and they're screening, you're checking boxes. Can you do the skills that they're looking for? And do you pass a general culture sniff test, right? That's going to be different than talking to a hiring manager that might be more procedurally based or based on technical information, versus maybe you're talking to the CEO of a company where they're more interested in strategic vision. How do you help them move their true north metrics? So each type of person that you speak to, you're going to have to alter what you're going to put forward and what you're going to focus on. And so when I do mock interviews with my clients, it's a really, really fun process because they're going to send me their job description, they're going to send me their resume, and all that good stuff. And then each week, I actually shift my persona with them. So sometimes I'm a really hard interviewer and I'm cynical, I cut them off. Sometimes I'm very conversational in the way that I do it, because that's a very different type of response that you're going to give. So the beauty and sometimes the challenge of interviews is you never know what you're going to get. So I can
Mhm.
talk to 100 different hiring managers and interviewers. There will be some trends, right? We want to focus on metrics. We want to focus on how you sell your technical skills. Can you be concise? Can you be organized? Are you credible? Are you personable? These are all things that people are looking for. But at the end of the day, every single hiring manager probably has their own checklist of things that they're looking for. And so it's on you as the candidate to evaluate in the moment, what is this person's style, what are they generally looking for based on how they're asking questions, and then how do you react in time. So that's part of that art, the artistic part of interviews, and it's all about human connection and how to pivot effectively.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's awesome that you put your applicants in different scenarios, because that's one thing that can intimidate new applicants who are interviewing, is that you can go from one interview where it's just a very casual conversation to another interview where it's very intense, and the interviewer is all about business, and cuts you off at times. So I think it's very beneficial that you really do put them in different scenarios so they're not caught off guard when they actually enter the real interview.
Absolutely. It's super funny. I work with a lot of law students, and I don't know how familiar you are with their kind of summer student and articling process, but they go through something called OCIs, or on campus interviews, and all of the top firms interview you on the same day. And they're 17-minute increments where you get to go drop in, do your interview, and then you're off to the next interview. Yeah, it's a very intense and stressful scenario because you really see the full gamut of interview styles and interview folks that are out there. And so as a way of preparing, the folks that I work with, I amp up the intensity. I amp up the types of questions that I ask. So I stray away from the ones that I probably know that they will be faced with. But the longer I work with them, the more challenging the questions become. And at the end of the day, they come back and they say, everything else felt so easy because in our mock interview sessions, you prepared me for kind of the crazies and you prepared me for the unexpected. And once in a while, that was true. But then I felt so confident that if I can tackle the crazies and the really complex questions, that I knew my story so well and how to adapt them, that when I was faced with a what are your greatest strengths, I knew how to react and I felt even more confident. So yeah, I think that push pull of trying to figure out and having people practice adapting, not just what are their stories, is really, really key to finding success in an interview process.
Gotcha. When h- how do you, like what are some techniques that you kind of provide to your applicants who are kind of not very public speaking people and they kind of get nervous when they're kind of tasked with like a one-on-one. So if someone is entering an interview, they have the butterflies in their stomach and they kind of trip over their words sometimes and their mind's running like 1,000 words per minute. Do you have any techniques that you use to kind of like calm their nerves so they can get uh, recouped back to one and then kind of progress on?
Public speaking anxiety is one of those things where we really get so worked up over it. And much like phobias that we have in any other scenario, sometimes it can be really hard to really find the root cause of why you're feeling that way. So the first thing that I always ask the folks that I'm working with, what is the what are you actually scared of, right? Are you scared of failing? Are you scared of not bringing value into the conversation? Are you afraid of a particular tick? Maybe there's this insecurity about the way that you use your hands when you speak. So I think the first thing is really trying to identify what it is that is causing some of that anxiety. And sometimes it's very complex and there are multiple factors, but focusing on one thing at a time is important. From there, we can understand what are the different techniques that we can use to try and address those anxieties. If one of those things is I speak a million miles an hour, then it might be something like put a little sticky note. And if you feel like you're speaking too slow, you're going at the right pace. Or if someone says, I have a lot of nerves and I feel it in my hands, it's like, let's play around with using hand gestures a little bit more dynamically so that you can A, show more animation, and then B, you can release some of that anxiety. Or if something is, it's like, hey, I'm afraid I'm not going to bring value. There's been a really great infographic from Harvard Business Review that talked about the power of reframing what it is that you do, right? So instead of saying like I'm not going to bring value, you can reframe it to what are some things that I'm an expert on, right? And you're asking yourself these questions, reminding yourself that, hey, I actually have more to offer than maybe what I'm giving myself credit for. So I would say figure out what the root cause is and then find little strategies to help you combat that. And sometimes that requires a little bit of research. Sometimes that requires talking to someone like me and figuring tactics that would work for you.
Yeah, I like I l- yeah. I like that you said that just to find um little things that kind of help it because I think a lot of people focus on the big picture and want to solve it in one go, but if you break it down into smaller pieces, you find solutions for each single piece, and that's more easier to tackle on than kind of just attacking the whole entire route. So I like your methodology on doing that part of it. Um, I lost my train of thought on what I wanted to say.
I will say, while you're trying to capture that back, is that the reality is sometimes it doesn't go away. I will be first
Mhm.
to admit that there are moments in my life, whether that's in a presentation or a job interview, or even working with clients from time to time, where I feel the nerves and I need to revert back to the things that I remind myself about. I used to be really, really bad with filler words, for example, or I have a habit of talking a little bit faster when I'm nervous. And I've developed strategies to go, these are the conscious things that I know exist. So instead of focusing on how nervous I am, I'm now focusing on maybe the things that I know I can consciously work towards. And whether it's anxiety or just enhancing your speaking skills in general, awareness and acknowledgement of what you want to get to, I think is a really big part of it, which is why 9 times out of 10, I ask people to record themselves and to watch themselves. I send them recordings of every single session that we have because you really start to notice, and then you find patterns of when your filler words come up, when you're a little bit faster with your speaking, when your hands look a little bit wonky when you're on camera. These types of things really start to latch on, and that awareness makes a huge difference.
Yeah, definitely. Um, the thing that I did want to ask you is like with the transition of how everything's becoming more remote. So interviews are being conducted over the phone, more final interviews are being conducted via Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and less of the in-person stuff. Do you find a lot of your applicants do better with virtual, and do you find any negatives of the whole process becoming virtual?
I don't think that I've seen a massive change in, let's say, success rates, right? I think the end goal of the interview is finding the best person for the job. And if you can sell yourself one way or another, that's generally fine. And it doesn't really matter whether or not you're in person or virtual. And I stand by that relatively strongly. Now there are some things that you need to adapt to, right? You don't get the opportunity to make meaningful eye contact or to lean in and show engagement and show people a virtual a physical copy of maybe your portfolio. So there are things that change, but they're simple fixes, right? Instead of looking down on your keyboard or your notes, you're looking at your camera. uh, you're framing yourself a little bit differently with where you're sitting. But these are easy fixes that I think a lot of people can figure out with just a little bit of trial and error. Now, in terms of whether or not there's a positive or negative effect, for me personally, I find I enjoy in person interviews more because I get to read the other person and gauge their level of interest and engagement. And I can maybe tack on things that I know excite them based on the little cues. Are they writing things down? Are they smiling? Are they looking at me differently? Are they asking more thoughtful questions, follow ups, these types of things? So that to me was is a big part of it. I love doing in person interviews just to be able to have a more real connection with the person. Um, but some people don't value that. So I think it really depends on who it is that is going through that interview.
When it comes to the end of interviews, I've always been told by uh, professors, articles online, to always ask questions at the end. And I know that there's a lot of websites that kind of provide like quote unquote the filler type of questions, like what's the progress for this career path, or what's something this that someone struggles with. How, like, as a hiring manager, are you able to like spot out those filler questions that you know that like when they didn't really have a question but they've been told that they should ask a question, so they kind of resort to this?
100%. I
Does that and then also does that kind of impact on how you view the applicant, or does it have any effect on their application status of when you're from the hiring perspective.
There's a lot of benefit to be had when you use the question and answer period of an interview to your advantage. If you don't ask the most thoughtful questions, am I going to say, oh, you're not a right fit? Maybe not, I'll be honest. But if someone's asking me real, thoughtful questions and maybe even strategically shows me that they know what they're doing, that to me is always a benefit, right? So 90% of people will come into an interview with their pre-prepared list of questions. What's a day in the life like? What's my career progression? These types of things, and you're familiar with them. My challenge to people is, if I were to take these questions and ask them to a different hiring manager, would it all still apply? And if the answer is yes, then you're not digging deep enough, in my opinion. Um, what does that look like? It might be asking about a particular challenge that you know that their product has, or their company has. It might be about a particular piece of news or accomplishment that you found on their news site that you want to dig a little bit deeper into. Those are the types of questions that can really show that you researched, also what's important to you. And that to me facilitates a better organic conversation with the hiring manager. Now, the second type of question that you can ask is always about the day in the life, and that's really important. I think as a job seeker, you need to know some of this information to make a informed decision about whether or not you want to join a company. So that's really great. But the number three is, think about, if you were on this person's team already, what are some of the things that you would ask, maybe in onboarding or as you're going through the motions of the job? What that looks like might be, what are some of the challenges that you're facing in Q4, knowing that it's a holiday season and it's a little bit busier and your clients don't have time for you, right? It might be, at my previous job or maybe as a student, I learned in this class that a success metric for sales is the number of sales qualified leads. Is that how you measure it? Right? So now you're automatically already showing them what it would be like to work with you. And finally, question type four is having the follow up. Whether you're following up to a question that they asked you. So you asked me about what's important in a customer success journey, right? How do you define customer success? So you're bringing it back to what they asked you, or maybe they answered a question of yours. Oh, you told me that sales qualified leads are a measure of success, right? So what tools are you using to measure that? Now it feels like an organic conversation. And when you can demonstrate that you can adapt and have strategic, tactical, pragmatic conversations with the hiring manager, now why wouldn't I want to continue that conversation with you? So that those are the four types of questions that I would try and ask, and vary between, different hiring managers that you're speaking.
Okay, that's awesome. That's a very good. Yeah, I've seen a lot of people who bring up stuff about the company themselves, like, "Oh, I saw that you just did this acquisition. Could you tell me more about that?" I've seen people who mention that in interviews, and if it's like a group interview type of thing, I've actually heard managers say this candidate said this and this, and that's a very um it puts them out in the spotlight of like, wow, they actually did their research on the company and actually asked. So I think that's a very good thing that you mentioned, that is pretty effective too. And this leads me to the my question for you is that, like, do post interview emails, are they really seen as very helpful? Because I've every website that you see about interview etiquettes, any class that you take on interview etiquettes, you'll always get told send a thank you email for their time, mention something about the interview that stood out from you, and send it to the hiring manager. But in my experiences, only like maybe 2% of the hiring managers actually respond back. And I always wondered myself, does is it really effective, and do hiring managers really care?
Yes, I think they do, consciously or subconsciously, right? Whether you're meeting someone for the first time on LinkedIn or whether or not you're wrapping up hour-long interview with someone who's considering hiring you and giving you money, right? Um, as a formality, I think it does set you apart. Now, not everyone actually follows through with that, right? Not everyone actually ends up sending a thank you message. And again, like asking good questions, like sharing compelling stories with context and scale, every single touch point that you have with the hiring manager is an opportunity to leave a memorable impression. And you'd be surprised. I've had conversations with people that were okay, and maybe they were second or third on my list of people to hire, but they sent a really thoughtful message. Um, and that puts them back into the running a little bit if they can show me that they're passionate, that they care, that they learn something, or maybe even bring value. They might say something like, "Hey, I was on your help center or your website and I noticed these things. Just thought you should know." Or, "Hey, we were talking about X, Y, and Z, and I found this amazing resource that you might be interested in," right? Again, it just shows how it would be like working with you after the fact. Now, I wouldn't go out of my way to force something like that. I think letting things happen organically is important and showing an authentic self of who
Mhm.
you are is important. But I do think it makes a difference. I've literally said no to people and they've written a message back, and it was so well articulated as to why they think they would be a good fit that I've invited them to an interview, even though I had already decided that, and they had gotten an email that I was gonna say no, that they weren't the
Hmm.
right fit. So I think there's a lot of power there if you can really harness it, and maybe you won't get every response or every hiring manager get back to you. And I've been guilty of that. I would be silly to say otherwise, but rest assured that they've read it, and whether or not they care or not, it does add towards who you are and where you stand.
Gotcha. Awesome. Yeah. I mean, for me, I've always told people that even ask me for interview advice to always just send the email because they may respond, they may not, but it also gets your name thrown out there again at the top of the email list. And should that help you? It doesn't hurt to send it.
Exactly.
And then one final thing that I wanted to pivot to is more toward the public speaking side of things. I know that I just had my talk with my manager, and she was saying that sooner or later you're gonna have to probably give a presentation to executives or managers or directors on a specific project that you've been working on. And when I first heard that, I was like, "Oh my god, that sounds horrifying." Little I'm this little soldier in the field right now, and I have to present to the higher people, and that can be really pressuring for a lot of people. What are like people who are kind of doing presentations for promotional purposes, or even just trying to sell themselves to other companies? Like when you have to present into a large group of people, what are some things that you kind of walk through with them to kind of help ease their nerves and how they should really like project their voice really.
For sure. I'm going to start with a philosophical conversation. um, i- Insofar as we oftentimes think about public speaking or selling ourselves, whatever it may be, with the lens that we need to fix everything, right? We come in, "Oh, I speak too fast. Oh, my filler words are through the charts. Oh, I'm a very timid speaker," whatever it may be. And people come to me and say, "I want to fix all these things stat." And that's fine. I think it's important to be introspective about what it is that maybe you think are your blind spots or growth areas. But never do people come to me and say, "I'm really great at this particular skill." Maybe you're a very animated speaker. Like me, I use a lot of inflection. I use my hands a lot. You can't see me, but I'm gesturing along versus someone that might be a very credible speaker. They're more informative in nature. Maybe they've done academia. their PhD student and they defended their thesis and they spent years and years and years developing a brand of expertise for themselves. Those are very different departure points. And for someone to say, I'm a very credible, grounded speaker, but I don't think I'm animated enough, that's not the right approach. You don't need to be animated to be a good speaker. Flip side of that is you don't need to be super informative to be a good speaker. So, first and foremost, philosophically, I want people to think about what is my speaking style? Where am I shining the most when I talk to people? Maybe on relatively speaking, you still don't think you're the next TED talk or whatever your barometer of success is. But when do you feel most comfortable? And when do you think you're most compelling? What types of models of doing, right? Do you tell stories better? Do you use metrics better? That's the number one conversation to have. After that, then it boils down to the bare bones of what we consider strong speakers, right? One part of it is structure. So, as someone walking into a boardroom, it's so important, like any other scenario, to have a good roadmap of where you're going and to guide people through that. So, what that looks like might be saying these are the different sections that we're going to go through today, and then very overtly saying the first section is this is the goal of what we're doing, and here are the stats or the process or the methodology that we used, and this is what you need to know as a reminder. The second thing is, and you're just walking through people through things. People like structure, people like chronology, and that facilitates a lot of credibility as a speaker. And then the second part of it is your delivery, right? Delivery can be a really tricky thing because it's hard to be very introspective about that. So going back to what I talked about, recording yourself and then figuring out what are some of the patterns that you have. If you're speaking too fast, what happens if I read out an article, for example, and slow it down a little bit? And do you notice the difference of how you appear? Do you have little ticks where maybe at the end of your sentences you're going with an up intonation, or maybe you're trailing off altogether? So you start to realize some of these things, you start jotting it all down, and you work on them one at a time to really help facilitate that. So those are the core things that I would be thinking about if you're maybe just starting out and figuring out, how do I present myself in the best light possible. It's actually a little bit of a audit of your structure, your style, and also your delivery.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah. It sounds like you have to be really self-observant and aware of your behaviors, um, to kind of spot out like the little, like you said, ticks or some imperfections of this of the things that you are doing. So it's I didn't that can be hard because sometimes you kind of just get lost in the content that you're speaking about, that you kind of forget on like what you're actually doing with your body. But I like that. I like that you did mention that. One thing I that I do that for me helps me a lot is that I also like to use my hands a lot, and I don't know if that's like a bad thing or if that's like a good thing, but it just makes me feel less awkward if I'm just standing there. And like these hand movements kind of give me more of like, I want to say like like it deters the attention away from me as my face speaking, but to my hands.
Yeah, hand gestures are an interesting one. There's a lot of research to suggest that if you're using gestures within what you kind of call the frame, so roughly underneath your neck to about where your waist is, that's the sweet spot for where a lot of gestures get noticed. So that's something that I would definitely think about. And if you're going to use gestures, use them with intention, right? Oftentimes, a very simple example might be there are 3 points and you're counting them out with your fingers. A lot of people that I've worked with, they have, let's call it a limp wrist, or maybe they don't use it with intention. If you're going to use gestures at all, then make sure that it's visible. Make sure that there's kind of tension in the way that you move. because that's what people are going to latch onto. Otherwise, it just feels like you're flailing, and that becomes a little bit of a distraction, right? Uh, the line of what I usually encourage people to think about is what I call the home stance, which is really simple, right? You want your feet shoulder width apart, standing up straight, shoulders back, and whether or not you want your hands to consistently be at the side of your body or up near your chest and kind of facing outwards, that's totally fine. So long as you're keeping it in check. And as I said, you're only using gestures with intention. And the reason why I say that it's important is there's a researcher named Alan Pease, really great body language expert. And he's done a lot of different studies about the nuance of gestures. So, for example, there's been a lot of talk about, let's say, your gestures where your palms are facing upwards or towards the audience versus the palms facing downwards, and your audience is seeing the backside of your hand. And what people correlated or what adjectives were used to describe somebody that had palms up versus palms down types of gestures, it was night and day. It was friendly, approachable, welcoming, open versus a little bit stiff and rigid and not so friendly. So the little nuances in how we move and the way that we carry ourselves, it actually has a really big impact, even if it's subconsciously on what people are associating with you. So that's why it's important to know yourself and to research and to also record yourself so that you get a good sense of what some of those habits are.
Gotcha. Very, very, very helpful. But um, fortunately, with time, um, I do have to end the podcast soon. Although there are a lot of things that I would want to ask you too, but with time constraints, this will have to be cutting it close to here because for me sometimes I say that we gotta end it but then I just go on tangents or the other person goes on tangents and it goes for longer than I would than I would want. But Marco, it was a very big pleasure talking to you more about public speaking, interviewing. You've definitely helped me with some of the flaws that I have with public speaking and interviewing, and I can't wait to implement your solutions of like what we talked about here into my next interview or even my next presentation upcoming up. So I thank you for that. Where can my listeners find you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Marco Yim, Yim. You can follow me through Extempora, which is my company, Extempra. That's extempora.com or on social. Yeah, I'm so glad to have had a chance to chat with you, and a huge nerd about these
Mhm.
things that you haven't figured out already. So yeah, chat with me, ask questions. I'm always open, and looking forward to hopefully getting to chat with you again.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Please at the end of this, please send me your links to everything, and I'll have them linked in the description of this podcast. And I will also post this up on LinkedIn myself. So new interviewers or new people to public speaking can get some advice on how they should prepare and how they can kind of improve on some of their skills. But Marco, it was a pleasure talking to you, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.